Welcome back to Section 8, East Meets West in Cultural Exchange. Our moderator is Professor John Lai. He is a professor in the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research interests include Christianity and China, Christianity and Chinese literature, religious translation, and the global I Ching studies. Professor Lai.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lucia. I guess good morning from those from Europe. Currently, I'm in Oxford on sabbatical leave. So good morning for those in Europe and good afternoon, I think, for those in Hong Kong or in Asia, right? So welcome to session 8 of this conference, East Meets West in Cultural Exchange. First of all, I'd like to thank Ansem for inviting me to moderate this session. Thank you. And today we've got 3 very interesting papers in this session. And without further adu, let me introduce the first speaker, right? Is my colleague from Chinese University of Hong Kong, Professor Xue Yu. Xue Yu is a research fellow at the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies. And his academic areas and interests include Mahayana Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, and the theological and historical dimensions of humanistic Buddhism. Currently, he serves as the director of the Center for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism in CUHK. He is also the chief editor of the journal Studies in Humanistic Buddhism. And today, he's giving a paper entitled Buddhism East and West, Mindfulness Meditation in America. I think each speaker has at most 30 minutes for the presentation. Okay, Professor Xue Yu, please.
Thank you, John. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Lam for the invitation for me to speak here. Actually, I was assigned for this topic for exchange of the religious culture. And I received this topic before I went to Chicago. And at that time, I was planning to teach one course in the Divinity School of Chicago, the course entitled Understanding of Buddhism Through Meditation. So then after I was there, I realized this kind of mindfulness meditation in America or in the West is quite different or somehow changed what is or what used to be in the East. So then I decided to, tentatively to write these papers. So how can I share the screen? Okay, so today is my presentation is recreating mindfulness meditation in America. So first of all, is the contents for the 4 parts. First, the making of American Buddhism, actually from the Buddhisms in America to American Buddhism. So American Buddhism, just like the Chinese Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, is some kind of special characteristic. I think that kind of special characteristics is mindfulness meditation today. And second part is from Vipassana meditation to mindfulness movement. Vipassana meditation actually originated from the East, actually Southeast Asia countries, then transmit to the West, especially to America, and gave rise to the mindfulness meditation movement in connection with other religious Buddhist meditation practice. And the third part is the main part of my presentation will be the recreating of the Dharma, how the leaders or activists of this kind of movement justify their practice of recreating this so-called mindfulness meditation through reinterpreting the Dharma. They claim they are not the Buddhists, they are not the Buddhism, but the practitioners of the Dharma. So this is my main part. So actually they dissociate with the Buddhism or any institution of Buddhism. So last part is some kind of tentative conclusion. This is how the repetition of this kind of historical events in Buddhism occurred in the past, and some kind of parallel between the past and the present. Okay, so first introduction. In the history of the more than 2,500 years, Buddhism spread from the middle state of Asia, India, to other parts of Asia, reading and taking the course of recontextualization when encountered with other cultures, and thus giving rise to the varieties of Buddhisms, such as Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Theravada Buddhism, as well as their substreams of Chan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, respectively. All these Buddhisms arrived in America one after another in modern history, readily transformed themselves in meeting with Christian religion and modern science, progressing from the Buddhisms in America to American Buddhism, in which the mindfulness movement has become the mainstream today. So first,
sorry to interrupt. Sorry. You, probably you can use the presentation mode of this full screen slide, so that we can see more clearly.
Can you?
Yeah. Okay, that's much better. Yes.
That's great.
Okay,
thank you for your reminder.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the making of American Buddhism. Actually, I think a brief history. First, Buddhism, I think some of you may know from actually brought to America from China by the Chinese immigrants in the 1840s. And then from Japan and from Southeast Asia and Tibetan Buddhism. And so in the 1950s, somehow they kind of so-called Buddhism of white Buddhists. In other words, the American Buddhists came to the stage. Actually, they learned, they were the disciples of the Buddhist masters from Asia, or they practiced, learned Buddhist meditation in Asia and returned. So they called the cultural Buddhists, intellectual Buddhists, or spiritual Buddhists, but they are not actually Buddhists religiously, by faith. So they embrace the Buddhism because they have some kind of interest, intellectual interest, also cultural interest, and also because they found somehow Buddhism made different from other religions, could parallel with the science. And so they embrace science and of Buddhism and study the Buddhism together with science, so-called the science of Buddhism, or the Buddhism of science. And then under these circumstances, in the last century, 1990s, so some kind of new movement, mindfulness meditation or mindfulness movement arise, because this the meeting of Buddhist meditation, neuroscience, and psychotherapies. So in brief, the history of Buddhism in America could be divided into three stages. First, before 1960s, for formative, I think this is just some kind of immigrants brought their Buddhism from different countries and then arrived in America, then continue to develop among the immigrants and then first generation of descendants. And the second one called, so we can transition from the Buddhisms in America to American Buddhism. That means some kind of special features of American Buddhism was developed. Something like the Zen Buddhism or Zen culture, I think it has been very influential in the 1960s, 1970s. And then in the 1980s, the Tibetan Buddhism. And in the 1990s, the most influential was the Vipassana movement from Southeast Asia countries. So here, I just very briefly introduce the Vipassana meditation. Actually, this is first originated in the modern time in the Myanmar. So they somehow practice, later by Buddhist monks, but they trained lay Buddhists to practice meditation. Before that, Buddhist meditation concentrated within Sangha, means monastic groups. Like in the modern times, so these monks, because they thought Buddhism is going to disappear because of this political or religious colonialism. So they expanded this kind of practice among the lay Buddhists, so become some kind of a movement called Vipassana movement. So this Vipassana movement is part of Buddhist meditation movement. In Buddhism, called the system of Buddhist learning consists of three parts: morality, meditation, and wisdom. So meditation actually consists of samatha and vipassana. Samatha means calmness or concentration. Vipassana means insight. So here, in the traditional Buddhism, if you want to practice vipassana, you must first practice samatha. Based on samatha, vipassana could be developed. But because this is a new kind of movement, so they directly practice the vipassana meditation or insight meditation without being based on the calmness or vipassana, called the samatha. And this kind of movement spread from the Myanmar to Southeast Asia countries and then brought to America by these immigrants. So third stage is somehow I could call, the formation of Buddhism with American characteristics. That means mindfulness meditation. So actually mindfulness meditation not only consists of so-called Vipassana meditation, but also I think borrowed a lot of techniques, theories from other meditation systems. For example, from Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, or even other religions, for example, transcendental meditation. So they all together, they just reinterpret the group together and form this kind of movement called mindfulness movement. And this kind of movement was enhanced by some white Buddhists who studied Buddhism and practiced meditation in Asia. A lot of them, they stayed in temples, not as monks, but as lay Buddhists, but lived as monks. So and after the training years and years, so they returned to America and set up some kind of meditation centers or mindfulness meditation centers. And they had large number of the followers to practice meditation. So here, I think this I already discussed is so-called Vipassana meditation in Asia. And when this kind of Vipassana meditation brought to America, so they must have some kind of change because culturally, socially, economically, or politically, or religiously, this kind of a different background. So they need to so-called decontextualization of the old and recontextualize it into the new culture, that means American culture or American society. So this kind of effort is done, by this kind of activists. So how could they justify this kind of decontextualization and recontextualization? So that means that is my main topic today for some kind of reinterpretation of the Dharma. So they redefined or reoriented Buddhist meditation. That means Buddhist meditation, not for Buddhists, not for lay Buddhists or monks, but for all. Even you are not non-Buddhists, you also can practice Buddhist meditation. So that means enlightenment is the door for enlightenment is open to all. So they simplified the meditation practice for the worldly benefits in this life. Not no any pre-requirements is needed, no any morality or any trainings. So also the Buddhist meditation is not for the nirvana or to achieve the highest spiritual development in the future, but for the benefit here and now, especially to deal with the problem we're facing today. So they interpreted the mindfulness meditation as this kind of, it's the definition: bear attention, non-judgmental, and be present. Or this definition, a part of the so-called mindfulness meditation or vipassana meditation in the East, but they took some, it's not a whole, it's a part. So they took this from the whole and emphasized it to fit into the contemporary society of the West, especially this so-called some kind of mental problem of the people to deal with this kind of problem. So this is the question of inheriting the tradition and reinventing tradition. So this, I will not elaborate on this topic. I would just give some kind of outline for you how they justify their this kind of reinterpretation. Certainly, yeah, the justification, because why they justify this kind of practice, because they was criticized by both Buddhists, non-Buddhists, or scholars, and as this kind of reinterpretation of movement as a distortion of Buddhism or secularization of Buddhism. So next, in the following, I would just take the Zen, Captain Zen, and his organization called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction as examples, as a part of this mindfulness movement, to show how this kind of justification was delivered. First, so it claims that, we are not Buddhists. Mindfulness movement is not a religion, not a Buddhism. So we promote this kind of meditation not to promote Buddhism per se, but for the sake of the people, because the people, I mean, in the West, they need this kind of practice. So this is we are practitioners. We are not Buddhists, and even they claim that, or they just say that the Buddha is not a Buddhist. So this is a very powerful statement. The Buddha is not a Buddhist. Then who is a Buddhist? So this is a very interesting statement and discussed among the scholars. So especially Kabata Zen, he said the Buddha is not a Buddhist, but he is a doctor and Dharma as a medicine for healing rather than curing the disease of the world in the past, today, and even the future. The world is full of suffering. The Dharma and the meditation is to healing the people and from suffering. So mindfulness meditation as medical practice and Dharma as a medical science. So this is some kind of pretext for them to medicalize the meditation practice in connection with the neuroscience or in the so-called psychotherapy. So mindfulness meditation is skillful means for the Dharma to enter into American society and serve the needs of American people without any religious or spiritual identity or labels. So this is maybe their strategy. So I'm not spreading Buddhism. I mean just for this kind of practice which will be good for those who practice it. So mindfulness meditation is neither Buddhism, and the practitioners are neither Buddhists or nor Buddhists. So this is a recreation, also kind of reinterpretation for the Dharma. So this is some quotations from the Kabata Zen. As early as 1975, he said, "I really don't care about Buddhism. It's an interesting religion, but it's not what I most care about. What I value in Buddhism is that it brought me to Dharma." So the Dharma here, I will explain a little bit what I mean by Dharma. So by this time, the mindfulness movement, such as MBSR from the institution of Buddhism, and by identifying with the Dharma, Kabata Zen was able to justify the medicalization of mindfulness meditation practice. So, I think that from the beginning of the MBSR, I bent over backward to structure it and find a way to speak out about it that avoided as much as possible risk it being seen as Buddhists' new religion, East mysticism, and just plain fake. To my mind, this was constant and serious risk that would have undermined our attempt to present it as a commonsensical, evidence-based, and ordinary and ultimately legitimate elements of mainstream medical care. So you can see they always want to bring this kind of practice or meditation practice into mainstream of America from the science, the medical science. So how do they deal with the traditional Buddhism? And they said, yeah, all Buddhisms, the past, present, and the future, or other practice, yeah, are the manifestation of Dharma in certain time and a certain area, certain areas. So they are not disregard or disrespect other religions or other institutional Buddhism or other Buddhist traditions, such as Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, or even new Buddhist movement. They are, yes, equally embodiment of the Dharma, yet they may not be as relevant or useful as a mindfulness meditation for today's world. So other Buddhisms are relevant, are the embodiment of the Dharma, but they are not very useful or more relevant or equally relevant for today's world. So that's why mindfulness meditation should be promoted. So mindfulness meditation is the embodiment of the Dharma and is useful for the world today. So this is some kind of justifications for this mindfulness meditation practice. So through reinterpreting the Dharma. So what is the Dharma? So Dharma in Buddhism is very difficult terms. Actually, it's one of the most difficult terms in Buddhist Buddhology or Buddhist theology. So it literally means that which upholds or maintains. So yeah, the Dharma could mean both essence and the phenomena, the laws, the universal truths, the mothers for all the Buddhas, the teaching of the Buddhas. All this could be mean the Dharma. So you can see this is very broad. So the activists or promoters of the mindfulness meditation, they made use of this broad term to elaborate or to interpret their or to justify their practice. So the Dharma, according to John Kabat-Zinn, he said, it's as the Dharma as the umbrella term. But he said the Dharma is a universal law, and the mindfulness meditation is the embodiment of the Dharma and the application of the law for dealing with human suffering today. So, quote, the word Dharma refers to both the teachings of the Buddha and also the way things are, the fundamental lawfulness of the universe. So although the Buddha articulated Dharma, the Dharma itself cannot be Buddhist anymore that the law of gravity is English because Newton or Italian because of Galileo. It is a universal law, end quote. So the Dharma is a universe, can be anywhere, anytime. So, but how this Dharma be manifested or embodied in the practice, so that is dependent on time and space. So mindfulness meditation is somehow the new embodiment of for Dharma for today's world. So by this kind of interpretation, so Kabat-Zinn and others are free of the traditional burden, so they could create anything new from this kind of so-called Dharma. So the teaching of the mindfulness will not be the same as advocating Buddhism, but to live a better life here and now. That means the Dharma, the embodiment of the Dharma, is for the world. So how the Dharma manifested depends on the need of the world. For today's world, especially the American mental suffered, so they need this kind of Dharma. So need kind of this practice. So Dharma manifested as mindfulness meditation. So here is a quotation, quote, mindfulness has nothing to do with Buddhism per se or with becoming a Buddhist, but it has everything to do with waking up and living in harmony with the world. It has to do with examining who we are, with questioning our view of the world and our place in it, and with cultivating some appreciation for the fullness of each moment we are living. So mindfulness basically means you need to live here and now at this moment. So by that kind of practice, the suffering, or especially some kind of mental suffering, suppressed or depressed, will be reduced or actually disappear. So why mindfulness meditation is chosen? Because I think somehow I said earlier, just to summarize, because mindfulness is the embodiment of a Dharma. Mindfulness is scientific and pragmatic. Mindfulness meditation is needed today. So this is some kind of justification. So by this kind of justification, so medicalization for mindfulness meditation through skillful means is possible. I think you may already know what I mean by skillful means, right? That means to the end, the means is justified by the end. So by all means to achieve that end. So this is somehow the mindful, so skillful means. Here, the ideal place to teach and practice mindfulness meditation would be hospital and a clinic where the MBSR could provide with contemporary healing, enable patients to understand the reality of the mental problems and sufferings of the world. So Kabat-Zinn said, quote, after all, hospitals do function as a dukkha magnet in our society, pulling for stress, pain of all kinds, disease and illness, especially when they have reached levels where it is impossible to ignore them, end quote. So that's why at the very beginning, they set up this kind of meditation practice in the hospitals. I think, first of all, Massachusetts University hospitals, and they expand to other hospitals and universities. And so today is spread, in the most part, large number of the hospitals in the United States, and not only this MBSR, but other the branches of mindfulness meditation movement. Okay, I think, John, how many?
Could you round up your presentation in around 2 minutes?
2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So this is, so this is also called, the practice of meditation as a service to others, as a practice of mindfulness as the bodhisattva. So the conclusion. The missionary religion and the mission of religion, I think for this symposium is somehow the missionary or the evangelization. I think how Buddhism, Buddhism actually is the first missionary religion to the world. Become the international religion in the 3rd century BC, during time of Ashoka. And also they have some kind of mission really to spread the Dharma. Here, I think the spread the Dharma means to serve, as I just said from this kind of discussion, so-called mindfulness meditation, to evangelize or to spread the Dharma is to serve the people who need the Dharma. That means because they are suffering, the Dharma is some kind of medicine to reduce or eliminate the suffering from living beings, especially from the human beings. So it's not in Buddhism is very seldom to say the converting. Convert means somehow it may change others to the faith, but to serve or to healing, to change oneself so that it could be benefit the others. So change oneself, that means just as I said here, means by elaborate or reinterpret the Dharma. So the meaning of Dharma can be changed, but actually the idea there means to serve the people. That very idea will not be changed. So there's a change the way, but the idea, the end will not change. So here, to serving and or the Dharma, meaning of the Dharma, something changed and the end changed should be there. So this is careful means. So somehow I think just very briefly, So recreating the mindfulness meditation is not the question of distortion or secularization, but the reinterpretation of the Dharma and the reinvention of the tradition to fit this kind of practice into the specific situation of time and space. So this kind of historical parallels in the past, so-called sanctification, I think you're most well known in the scholarship, sanctification for Buddhism, how Buddhism changed from Indian to Chinese Buddhism by some kind of interaction with Confucianism and Taoism and a rising of Chan Buddhism. So first moral ethics and then philosophical ideas. And in modern time, I think modern philosophy and the science of the West. For example, Yogacara, Madhyamika of Buddhism and comparative study with the Western philosophies. And the modern science, so classic physics, relativism, and somehow the articles called quantum mechanics. So mindfulness meditation somehow become popularized or somehow is rooted in the West because they follow this kind of tradition to medicalize the practice, and so it could be accepted or considered as a science, especially, and once practice it will be benefit or useful to deal with the contemporary, some kind of mental problems. Towards the end of the 20th century, the mindfulness meditation, a movement originated from the Vipassana of Theravada Buddhism, in combination with other forms of meditation practiced in Mahayana Buddhism, became mainstream of American Buddhism, thanks to the scientific study of Buddhism and the medicalization of the meditation practice. The arising of the mindfulness movement in the West is certainly related to the tradition of Buddhism, yet its promoters or activists distanced from the latter by embracing Dharma instead. The mindfulness meditation becomes the modern embodiment of the Dharma rather than part of a traditional Buddhism or Buddhisms, so that its new practice and culture could be justified. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thierry, Professor Thierry. Thank you for your interesting talk. And we have a panel discussion after the 3 presentations. Okay, so let's proceed to our second presentation from Professor Gianni CRIVELLER. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So Professor CRIVELLER is a theologian specializing on the encounter between China and Christianity. He has taught in Hong Kong and Greater China since 1991. He teaches at the Holy Spirit Seminary College in Hong Kong, and is also a research fellow at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Currently, Professor CRIVELLER is Dean of Student Studies and Professor of Theology at the PIME International Theological Missionary Institute in Monza, Milan. And he's a very prolific author. He has authored and edited about 20 books and hundreds of essays. Very impressive indeed. So, Professor CRIVELLER?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Very clear.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Good morning for people listening from Europe or America, and good evening for people in Hong Kong. I am myself in Hong Kong in these days, and I'm happy to contribute to this symposium, and also would like, of course, to thank the organization team who invited me. It's a privilege for me to speak here. I attended the last yesterday and the day before yesterday to all the talks, And therefore, I decided to make a little bit of a change in my presentation, because originally my presentation was especially historical presentation about the incoherent practice of accommodation by propaganda fide in China and Asia. And then I would like more to stress some relevant aspects that are meaningful for today and future evangelization in China and all around the world, in fact, not only Asia. I will speak, especially at the beginning, mostly as a theologian. And then also I decided to start from the end, in the sense that I decided to express, to illustrate what are my conclusions. So because I want to make sure that I'm able to say at least this, the conclusions. And then and if the time has to stop, then people who are interested in the spelling out of the history, and then who will demonstrate the points, then you can read my paper later on. But in fact, in order not to repeat a few things that sometimes were occasionally already mentioned during the symposium, I decided to focus, also inspired by several of the papers that we heard, especially the talk by Cardinal Tagle in the beginning, who was very inspiring, so I think. So my presentation will focus around three major focus and three major ideas. One is about faith and accommodation, or interculturality, and the issue of accommodation, because this was originally the policy of propaganda fide in China from the very beginning. We will see that. The second question that I will focus in my presentation is about a question of language and translation. When I say language, I do not mean simply language like I'm speaking now in English. Some people speak Chinese, other people speak in Italian, but is a language as today philosophy understands it, as the abode of existence. So there is no even thought, there is no even existence without a language, because the language is the way. So this is, but the language and translation, because in China, in the 17th, 18th century, the question of language was very, very relevant, very relevant. And there was and even the Chinese rights controversy that was often mentioned is, first of all, in my interpretation, a question of language, of conflicts about interpretation of Chinese ideograms, Chinese characters. Is it possible to translate a doctrine into a new language, means into a new word? The third question is about mission as the mission of the people of God. For many years, for centuries, in fact, especially from China, there was a quest for allowing Chinese priests to become leaders in their own country, in their own church, and that was not allowed. So now, how is the relevance of that? Now, who are the protagonists of missions? The protagonist is the people of God, all the baptized, all the disciples of Jesus. They have the same dignity and the same task in participating to the mission. So these are the three main ideas. So the first one, you might remember, is faith and accommodation. China mission proved that accommodation is the result of the encounter between faith and culture, is an imperative in the process of evangelization. We cannot do without accommodation. Not even those who are against accommodation can do without it. In the early days, Propaganda Fide acknowledged that accommodation is an imperative, but it was unable to walk coherently on that line, to be consistent, to practice that policy. The relationship between faith, mission, and culture is made even more complex today. It was already complex many centuries ago in China, but if you look at the situation today in China and everywhere in Asia and the world, it's even more complex because of the complexity of culture and cultures. Numerous cultures coexist in the same village, in the same city, in the same community, even in the same family. But not only that, today, in the postmodern and post-human complexity, different culture coexist within each one of us. We ourselves, each one of us, even if we are not aware of that, we are multicultural subject. And the different cultures within ourselves might even be in opposition. So each one of us has not only one culture, but different culture. It's a very different business when we go into internet and to search and then we lose time doing that, or when we go like myself in a church and we pray before God. I realize myself that I'm living like in two different, completely different worlds, and even myself produce different cultures. Accommodation, and this is why like Benedict XVI suggested in a conference in Hong Kong many years ago, we can use the term interculturality today, because interculturality gives the idea that the relationship is not between the gospel and one culture, but between different cultures. And the gospel does not exist without cultures. Accommodation was a major feature in Jesuits' mission. We are aware of that. We spoke many times in this symposium about that. And accommodation, this word accommodatio, in Latin is accommodatio, where it comes from. The theological roots of this term accommodatio is on Thomas Aquinas, and then also Erasmus of Rotterdam. And then we have Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus. The three of them speaks about accommodation. Thomas Aquinas adopted the term accommodation to describe the process by which in the Holy Scriptures, in the Bible, God has spoken to humanity in a human fashion in order to make God unknowledgeable to us, in order that we are able to understand God. We will go back to this point because in my opinion, it's fundamental. God accommodates us by speaking in our own language. So God make a translation. And then we have Erasmus of Rotterdam that introduced the concept of accommodatio Christi, the accommodation of Christ. Christ, the Son of God, became human to accommodate to us. So otherwise we could not know anything about God if it was not for this accommodation by Christ. And the founder of the Society of Jesus, Ignatius of Loyola, adopted the principle of accommodation for mission. Ignatius of Loyola said to his missionaries, it is not that they, the people we go to, has to become like us, but we have to become like them. So accommodation is not simply a missionary strategy, but is an imperative element of Christian mystery. Now I go to the second point, the question of language. Language was a central missionary issue in the controversies in China. I will have probably time to illustrate that, but please take that for granted, and then you can investigate that. Language is not just a tool of communication, but is in itself communication. The specific existential form of expressing one's own reality. Language is the abode of existence, its form and its boundaries. So if we want to evangelize, we have to know the language of the people we want to reach out. Do the evangelizers today know the postmodern and post-human languages? What do we know about the languages of the young people immersed into the digital reality? Is our language, when we evangelize, meaningful to the people of today? So mission is not longer today a question of making the gospel known to people outside the Christian boundaries, outside the nation, outside the Christian nations, the missionary nations. This concept, the geographical concept of mission, is already gone. The mission of today is to meet the new world of the people of today that live in different cultures. And therefore, in order to do that, we have to translate the Christian message in a language that is understandable for the people of today. I wonder whether we are really doing that. Not that it is easy. In China, there was not easy. The controversies was because the question was very difficult, but today is even more difficult if possible. Translating is a form of accommodation. So it's again about the imperative of accommodation. So we have to accept the risk of doing translation, which of course is much more than just simply translating from English to Chinese or from Latin to Greek. It's a very different process. The translation of a Christian message into an understandable, a contemporary language is the new difficult frontier of accommodation, or rather of evangelization. We have seen that Thomas Aquinas observed that God speaks to us in a human language, and this, he adopted the term accommodatio to express that concept. God accommodates us by speaking our own language. If we say that the Bible is the word of God, I'm talking to Christians here, and in fact, such it is. The Bible is the word of God, but in fact, in a very important sense, is a human word. And even imperfect, as imperfect are several biblical passages, words, and episodes. So, if the Bible was not a human word, we will not be able to understand that. So this is a process, is very, in my opinion, it's very important to grasp this, because without accommodation, there is no communication. And without communication, there is no evangelization. The third point I would like to make is the question of mission as a mission of the people of God. We know that from the theology of mission of today, that it is mission who generates the church and not the other way around. So the fate of mission is the same, is the fate, is the destiny of the church. China missionaries, we are talking about now 17th, 18th century, but even later, even up to 20th century. China missionaries asked several times for entrusting the church to local clergy. But that was not achieved until very recently. Chinese priests were discriminated against and given a second-class position because of the colonial and other unjustifiable behavior. Today, it is no longer a question of local clergy who is doing mission, the local clergy. No, but it is a question of restoring mission to those to whom it belongs, the disciples of Jesus, the baptized, the entire holy people of God. For me, this is a very important. So every baptized faithful woman or man, being a Christian, as the name says, is another Christ. So all baptized are kings, responsible participants in the community in imitation of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. All baptized are priests, that is capable of offering their lives to God in imitation of Christ, the only one and the holy priest. All baptized are prophets, that is missionaries, who announce the word of the gospel of life and peace. If we take this doctrine seriously, we will already be a completely different church and a different mission. The church must become the church of the baptized, women and men, with their charism and ministries without discrimination. We are in an age of image, but this idea of image I'm talking about is not a superficial idea of the image. The Jesuits in China evangelized through images, through pictures, including maps. We talked earlier about maps. Maps, in fact, were an image. So the missionaries produced maps, geographical maps, in order to let people know the earth, which is a creation by God. And so knowing the creation, they will know also the creator. So the idea of the image, in my opinion, is very important. Ignatius of Loyola has taught to his missionaries and to the Jesuits to meditate on the life of Jesus through the fruition of images. So what is today the image of the church that people see is not a good image, in my opinion. It's not an image where the church is really the church, a people of God, with all people, men and women and men are accepted, and they have the same dignity, and they are responsible in the same fashion for the evangelization. We still have an image of the church that is an all-male, a clerical, a patriarchal, and a vertical and authoritarian society. And this is not an evangelical church. We had in the past this kind of image, the image of a church that belonged only to the foreign missionaries. They did not only bring the gospel, but they also became the leaders of the church. And therefore, the church was understood by many people in China, and still now by many people in China, in Asia, and everywhere in the world, as a foreign body. A church is not something that belongs to our society, our culture. It's a foreign body. Even a lot of the religious policy is based on this idea. The church is not Chinese, because it was done by foreign people. But now we have so many people, women, young people, who consider the church as something that is not their family, because they are not respected, they are not understood, they are not accepted, they are considered second-class Christians. And in my opinion, this is a very, very serious matter in the process of evangelization. And then this is why also the evangelization encounters so many difficulties. And then many people are even leaving the church rather than entering the church. So these were my conclusions. So I don't know how much time I left, because I will be happy also with concluding like this. But since I think I still have a few minutes, Is it correct?
Yes, a few minutes.
Yes. So
Yes.
I would like to enter more in the historical illustration of the points I tried to make, because all the points I made, accommodation, language and translation, mission as the mission of the people of God, are rooted in studying the history, especially the history of evangelization in China. We know that the Propaganda Fide was started in 1622 and had an innovative vision, thanks especially to his founder, Francesco Ingoli. And Propaganda Fide became the best Roman Curia informed office on worldwide affairs. They collected so much material that became a front runner of the Vatican all over the world. And even this material is still available now in the archive. Menegon in the first day spoke about that. It was very interesting. And the Propaganda Fide, we said that many times, was founded to emancipate the missions from the Spanish and Portuguese patronage, from the colonial. So Propaganda Fide started very well. And in 1659, Propaganda Fide issued an instruction for missionaries going to China, also not only China, in fact, also to Vietnam. And this is a very important document, which is known as the Magna Carta of the congregation. So I read one passage, one famous passage of this instruction. I quote, "Do not make any effort, do not use any means or persuasion to induce those people to change their rights, their lifestyle, and their customs, unless they are openly contrary to religion and good morals. In fact, what is more absurd than transplanting, that importing France, Spain, or Italy, or some other countries to European countries to China. This is not what you must introduce, but faith, which does not reject or harm the rights and the customs of any people, provided that they are not bad, but rather want to safeguard and consolidate them." End of quotation. This was in 1659, but I found quite remarkable and also unhappy the circumstance that this instruction were not put into practice, not even by the missionaries that the Propaganda Fide sent to China, the so-called propagandisti, the missionary expressly sent to China. And this is, of course, is a very unfortunate turnout, and somehow this situation influenced very negatively the missionary results in China. We did not only have the Chinese rights controversy, which is about accommodation, about different theological understanding, and there is also about linguistics, how to translate a message in a different context, in a different word. It's especially about this. I spent many years studying this controversy. Of course, there is also political issues there, but mostly it was a controversy about how to be, what does it mean to be missionary. And then we have a quest for a liturgy in Chinese language. Since the very beginning, the successor of Matteo Ricci, Longobardo, in 1615, asked the Pope, the name of the Pope on that day was Paul V, to allow in China to use Chinese as liturgical language. Because in order to allow more Chinese people to become priests and to be missionaries among their own people. This request was done many times from China. In different, I have here a list of all the papers that were written, the missionaries who wrote those papers, the Chinese people who wrote those papers, even, and then later on in 18th century, it was Stefano Borgia, another, he was an Italian prefect of Propaganda Fide, who also promoted the Chinese as a liturgical language until very recently. But in fact, the Pope Paul V gave the permission to use Chinese as a liturgical language already in 1615. Yet that concession, the right to use Chinese as a liturgical language was never put in practice in China, until the point that when I first started to travel to China in the early 1990s, in most Chinese churches, the Mass was still in Latin. I'm not against Latin, of course, but what I'm saying here is that the process of evangelization and the process of accommodation was not coherently put into practice in China, and this is, of course, it was very regretful. So I will skip all these presentations, all the dates and the name of people and the name of documents that are involved in this process. Of course, after the Council of Vatican II, the Council of Vatican II promoted the practice of accommodation and inculturation, even if this term was never, in fact, inside the documents of the Vatican II. But in the post-Council of Vatican II, the popes started to talk about the importance of accommodation and inculturation, and praised Matteo Ricci as a missionary that put in practice all these policies. So Matteo Ricci, from being a missionary that was marginalized, so to speak, after his life and not during his life, now all the recent popes, starting from John XXIII, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis, praise Matteo Ricci as a great exemplary missionary that adopted the practice of accommodation. I want to be clear, in my theological understanding, accommodation is not a form of watering down the gospel in order to make the gospel likable to the people. This is not about that. Very differently, the term of accommodation, which is in fact what even God has done with us when He accommodates. If God speaks the language of God, we will not be understandable for us. God speaks to us the language of humans, even, you know, even with the difficulties and the limits of that. So accommodation is really at the heart of Christian mystery, and is at the heart of the evangelization process. The damage caused by the failure to apply the accommodation imperative is still hovering over us. As I mentioned earlier, in some Asian areas, Christianity is still considered a foreign religion. Yet, in my understanding, in its original inspiration, Christianity is not even a religion. It's a spiritual message and a faith, and definitely is not something foreign, not at all. Christianity is a universal faith. Okay, I think I can stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Attention.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Professor CRIVELLER, for your fascinating, profound, and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much. I hope we have more time for discussion after the third presentation.
Okay.
Okay, let's proceed to our third presentation today by Professor Thierry MEYNARD. So Professor MEYNARD is a professor at the philosophy department of Sun Yat-sen University, Guangzhou, where he teaches Western philosophy and Latin classics. He is the vice director of the Archive for the Introduction of Western Knowledge at Sun Yat-sen University. And since 2006, he has been a member of the Macau Ricci Institute. Again, he's a very prolific author. His publications in English include The Jesuit Reading of Confucius, published in 2015 by Brill. And most recently, he co-edited with Daniel Canaris a brief response on the controversies of over Shangdi, Tianshen, and Linhuan, published in 2021. Okay, today, his presentation is very interesting, entitled Promoting the Sinicization of Catholicism in Republican China, the Role of Propaganda Fide in Canton. Professor MEYNARD, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Lidzopong, for this nice introduction. And I would like to thank also the organizer and for the invitation, and Dr. Lam and Father Roflin. I have attended the 3 days of the conference, and for me it has been a very fruitful. I mean, open a new insight, new ideas. So thank you very much for all this. So today I'm going to now to share my screen. I'm going to talk about perhaps someone who is not very well known today, which is in fact about Fourquet in Guangzhou. So why I chose this topic? In fact, because when I was invited for this conference, I was thinking perhaps to do something about late Ming and early Qing, which is my period of investigation. But just as we mentioned with Father CRIVELLER and other speakers, in fact, the role of the propaganda at that time is very controversial because there has been a big clash. And I believe that the clash somehow could not be completely avoided, and because it was somehow legitimate for the Vatican at that time to take a control somehow of the mission in all over the world, and so there was somehow impossible to avoid a conflict with, I mean, Portugal, Spain, and all the religious order. But the problem is that with the right controversy, of course, the propaganda used, in fact, the right controversy to assert his authority over the mission. And so it became somehow also as a kind of power tool in China. And so, and that resulted in very bad consequences, as we just mentioned. So it's why today my talk is not so much about that, but I decided to look at a more positive role of the propaganda, which I think is in the first part of the 20th century. And so for this, I took the example of Guangzhou, because in fact, it happened that I have access to some archive. So in fact, the archive of the Diocese of Guangzhou have been in Guangzhou, and after they went to Macau, and to Macau to Portugal, and from Portugal they were brought by Father Malatesta to San Francisco, and now they just moved to Boston, and so they are at the Ricci Institute. And so those archives of the Guangzhou Diocese have been digitized, and so I can use that. And also I have Professor Menigan has introduced the archives in Rome of the propaganda. And so I had the chance 2 years ago, in fact, to use those archives. And so I could also see the archives related to Guangzhou at the archives of the propaganda. And also I had also the chance to go to Paris and to see the archives of the MEP. And so with those 3 archives, I think we can have quite a good understanding of what was happening. So my material mostly is about Western documents, even though in the archives of the Guangzhou Diocese, now at Boston College, in fact, we have also some Chinese documents. So I'm going to give first a kind of background about Guangzhou. So in fact, we have to go back to the creation of the vicariate in 1848. And it was, at the creation, it was entrusted to the MEP. And so we have a very prominent, very important figure, which is Zéphirin Guillemin. And so very, very important for the development of the Catholic Church at that time. So in fact, at that time, the vicariate was not only Guangdong, but also Guangxi. So it was a very huge territory. But of course, the problem is that from the very beginning, the development of the church in Canton was very much linked to French imperialism or colonialism. And so, for example, Zéphirin Guillemin, he had this idea that France had a special mission toward China. And so in some documents, he will go back to Louis XIV, about the Louis XIV sending French missionaries to Beijing, what we call the Jesuit mathematician. But sometimes he will go even earlier. He will go sometimes to perhaps St. Louis, because there had been a few French people also going at that time into the Yuan dynasty. Another important event was, of course, the murder of Chapdelaine in 1856 in Guangxi. But in fact, this murder, it was a very bad case, and probably it was mostly a kind of isolated incident. It was really a kind of local official who took over him and to make this very harsh punishment over Chapdelaine. But the MEP and after the French government are using this to make it a pretext to start the second Opium War in 57 and 58. And so we have at that time, I mean, the French and the British Navy, they come to Guangzhou and they shell donc the palace of the governor of Guangdong, Guangxi, Yemingshen. And so that it was a terrible things which happened, symbolically, the destruction of this site of the Yamen by the French and the British Navy. And after that, in the Treaty of Tianjin, we have the creation of the French protectorate over all the Catholic mission. And so that also was a creation somehow of the French Catholic Church. The idea that the French had a mission not only over the French Catholic, but over all the Catholic, Chinese and other countries. They were all depending on the French protection. So that gives you a kind of background of this kind of colonial church, which was at that time established. And so we have, perhaps in kinds of times, in terms of contrast, we have in Guangzhou something very different at that time, which is a kind of revolutionary canton, because the canton was the cradle of the revolution. And so we have someone like Sun Yat-sen, who at that time was very also controversial person, because Sun Yat-sen tried to make the revolution with the support of the local triad. And so it had the idea of hiring this kind of triad with money and to stir up a kind of revolution. And for him, for Sun Yat-sen, the revolution should start in Guangdong and later to propagate into the North China. And so he had always, for 20 years, this idea of revolution starting in Guangdong with the support of the triad. And also, of course, it was a place with very progressist ideas in Guangdong. And what we have, especially in 1920, we had the establishment of a revolutionary government under the KMT. And so it is a very radical government, which has a very progressist program. And especially there is the input of the Soviet. And so at that time, Lenin is sending a special counselor called Mikhail Borodin. And Borodin is going to play a very, very important role in this revolutionary government, because he's going to reorganize the party and the KMT with a very strong centralized leadership to organize the government. It means that at every level of the government, you will have also the representative of the party. It's going to launch also a mass movement, and so to the workers, the peasants, all of that are going also to participate to this movement. And so we have at that time also the rise of what we call a national consciousness, and the idea that to build a country, China, independent. And we have a strong request for abrogating all the unequal treaties, and also for social and economic reform. And we go very far, because there is the idea also to distribute the land, to take the land from all the landlord and to distribute them equally, and so kind of rural reform. So also there is in Guangdong, but it started also in Beijing, of course, this anti-Christian movement, but it becomes very strong also in Guangzhou. It's going to happen also a big clash in 1927, because inside the KMT, of course, you have the leftist and the rightist. And so after the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek is going to purge the communists. And so that is going to be something very important, but that is going to create a reaction from the communists, because on December 1927, they have a big uprising in Guangdong and in Guangzhou, and they try to do a military operation to take over Guangzhou, but they fail. But after that, in fact, we have a warlord who is going somehow to get the power. So, and he somehow is going to be a kind of autonomous from the KMT, and is going to have his power from quite a long time, from 1929 to 1936. And of course, in the Japanese attack on Canton in 1938, and also at the same time over Hong Kong. And so at that time also, the cathedral is partly damaged. So that is to give you also the kind of context of what's happening at that time. Now we can see someone who plays a very important role, Guébriant. So Guébriant, in fact, he was first a bishop in Sichuan, and after he was named bishop or vicar of Guangzhou. And somehow is very ambivalent role, because at the beginning he plays very much the idea of transfer of changing the model of the church and of promoting the local clergy. But so he is writing a report to Rome, to the propaganda, and this report got the attention at that time of Van Rossum, and so he plays a very important role. but at the same time is quite ambiguous, because we can see here a conference that he gave in Paris in 1923. So I translated here into English, and he said, the Chinese clergy will quickly outnumber the missionary clergy, and there is no doubt that always better trained in establishment, always better organized, they shall realize their importance and see clearly that the world future depends on them. So it is very clear assessment of the trend. Under this condition, will they accept European leadership indefinitely? It is not possible, and it will not be human. And here comes the question of the Chinese episcopate. So here we see the two questions, promoting the Chinese clergy, so that is one way, but also promoting the Chinese episcopate. Surely they have too much common sense to prematurely demand what must be done sooner or later. And the Chinese Catholic, the first, will protest a precipitous and abruptly generalized transition from the traditional administration of missionary bishop to that of the Chinese bishop. And so here you see clearly that there is one day later or sooner, it had to happen, and that the power has to be transferred to the Chinese bishop. But it is up to the missionaries themselves to foresee the unavoidable with its advantages and dangers, to assure the maximum of the former and to minimize the latter, and to proceed under the direction of the Holy See to trials well distributed and well graduated. So we see here in his conclusion here that in fact he adopted a very cautious approach. And so for him, in fact, the transfer should not happen immediately. It should be a kind of very long process and with many trials. And so in fact, what we see, especially when Gabriel is going to become also the superior general of the MEP in Paris, in fact, is going somehow to be of slowing down somehow the movement and somehow of being opposed. And we see that in the case of Guangzhou, but other cases is going to be opposed of transferring the power of the MEP bishop to the Chinese bishop. So here, in fact, we see someone very important, which is Costantini, who is named as apostolic delegate to China, right? And with the rank of archbishop. And he has two missions from Rome: to promote the Chinese priests as bishops of existing vicariate, and to create new territorial entities entrusted entirely to Chinese bishop and clergy. So in fact, the first point is going to be very hard for him to achieve. But what he could do is the second point, to create new entities which are very remote. If you see the list of the 6 first bishops, they are all in remote area, and they are not in the big cities. So in fact, my paper tried to show there is a very strong connection between Costantini and Fourquet, because Fourquet, in many letters writing to Costantini, he had ideas, and Costantini is going to adopt those ideas and to also to transmit them to Rome. And so, for example, some of the ideas of Fourquet that are going to be adopted by Costantini is the idea that there is a quick nationalistic transformation happening in China. So the church should respond quickly to that. We cannot delay, and like Gabriel say, with very small trials. Also, Fourquet is very strong on the idea that we need to discard the French protectorate and to end any privilege. But that again, many people are going to fight against him, among the MEP, but among, of course, other congregation. Also, a third point, fighting against the xenophobia of the foreign missionaries and their need for conversion. So that it is a very strong point of Fourquet about the mentality of the missionary, which has to change, because the missionary, they still believe they are superior, and they hate somehow everything Chinese. And so they need a big conversion of faith, in fact. And so in many letters, Fourquet described those incidents with his colleague of MEP. For example, one day, one MEP priest refused to be seated at the same table with a Chinese priest, because that was against the prerogative of the missionaries. So we have all these reports, and Fourquet advocating for a big change. So what are the changes that are going to happen? In fact, a change which was already started by Guébriant was to invite non-French congregation in the vicariate. And for example, the Salesian, they went to Shangguan in 1920, and the Merinol, they went to German in 1924. And so that was already a way of breaking somehow this holding of the French into the vicariate. But somehow some opportunities were missed. For example, German, in fact, there was the priest called Yang Fujue. Later he will become a bishop. We are going to talk about him. So Yang Fujue at that time was based in Shangchuanda and that part. And somehow he was against this project of giving this part of German to the American missionaries, because they say, we have been the local priest, we have been doing work there. I think we feel more adequate to the job. But in fact, that didn't happen. Because, of course, the decision was not purely in the hand of Guébriant, but was also in the hand of the Merinol discussing with Rome. Also, there is another attempt in Royuan, and that 10 years later, to start again to establish indigenous vicariate. Again, quite of isolated place, but that doesn't work either. So what is an interesting idea of Fourquet? So Fourquet has the idea, okay, let us have a Chinese bishop in the big cities. So it is not only like the 6 first bishops who have been appointed to very remote territories, but we need a Chinese bishop in the big cities. And so is why, starting from the very early on, is going to ask for a Chinese successor in Guangzhou. And so Rome, in fact, in the beginning, agreed to give him an auxiliary bishop without the right of succession. And so there is a long process, and in fact, in this process, the headquarters of the MEP in Paris, they try to slow down or even to go against this project. But finally, Yang Fujue is made the bishop in 1931. And after the celebration, Fourquet, he gathered other bishops like Zhu Kaimin, James Walsh, Ignacio Canazei, and Enrico Valtorta and Manuel Prat. And he said, okay, let us discuss about a common letter to be sent to Rome, asking for the nomination of a Chinese coadjutor bishop, or at least auxiliary bishop, in all the major cities of China. So that's what was the idea, that what he has done with Yang Fujue in Guangzhou could be replicated in Shanghai, in Beijing, in all the big dioceses. And so that will make a very strong impact. And in fact, Fourquet, very early on, he already was pushing for that, because in 1928, he was sent to Beijing to attend, or to be a kind of, to do a visit, a canonical visit in Beijing. And he was pushing for appointing a Chinese bishop in Beijing. But of course, he got a lot of pushback from the Vincentian and also from the French diplomat who were against that. Later on, in 1936, Fourquet asked directly the propaganda to prepare for the transfer of the Canton Vicariate, that the transfer of the power to the Chinese clergy. I need to have really a Chinese successor. So you see, he's pushing very much this idea. But the problem is that 1936, there is the war with Japan, and 1938, unfortunately, Yang Fujue died at the age of 60 years old. And so things could not be realized.
Professor MEYNARD, sorry to interrupt. Would you like to round up in 3 minutes?
Okay, sure.
Sorry,
So finally, I would like to give a few ideas about also how Fourquet was involved into the social work. And that happened because in 1938, the KMT withdrew from Guangzhou and all the high officers. And so he was called by the KMT and the government of Guangzhou to take charge of the social works and so of the hospital there. And so here I put on 8 December 1948, so Ouyang was the mayor of Canton, honored Fourquet with a kind of a medal. So here is my conclusion. In the 19th century, the French government and the missionaries, MEP, Lazarist, and Jesuit, progressively imposed the idea of the protectorate of France. And it was only with Maximum Miloud in 1919 that the propaganda attempted to disentangle itself from the colonial power of France. Ambrose Monge stated that the failure of the missionaries in China was closely linked to their reluctance in handing over the leadership to the local clergy. So he said, with the local clergy in charge, the issue of language and cultural adaptation would have been resolved. And of course, when we see the example of the Protestant, it happened like that. So this suggests that the reasoning of delaying the transfer of power to the local until they meet the requirements, so that the logic of Guébriant was flawed. Founding new seminaries, recruiting a local vocation as Guébriant advocated, could not solve the basic problem. As the propaganda and Constantini and Fourquet clearly understood, the local clergy needed to be first empowered through the nomination of Chinese bishops, not only in remote mission territories, but also in the major cities of China. So in the spirit of Maximum Miloud, Fourquet made a great effort to insert the church into the Chinese political reality. Though the Catholics in Europe were traditionally monarchist and suspicious of the Republic, Fourquet succeeded to develop quite polite relationship with the revolutionary government of Canton. And so here I have to say that, of course, he was not a red bishop, as he was called. He was not a communist, but he tried to work with the revolutionary government. Through all his engagement, Fourquet wanted the Catholic Church not to be a colonial church, but inserted within the Chinese modern society. And so he received strong support from the propaganda. But of course, he came into conflict with his MEP colleagues in Guangdong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor MEYNARD. I think this is a very original, well-researched, and also very substantial presentation. Thank you so much. Now it's time for panel discussion. I think we have around 22 minutes or so for the panel discussion. In case you have any question, please feel free to type into the chat room. And in fact, we have received a couple of questions. So I try to select some questions for the presenters. Maybe I start with a question by Oscar Ngai. It's a question for both Professor Xue Yu and Professor CRIVELLER. So the question is that there is no Buddhist centralized authority like the Holy See. So there is a greater freedom of interpretation of Buddhist terminology. Terms like Dharma or Dukkha have received a great interpretation in the English language. But there is not something possible in the Catholic Church. Okay, so I'm not going to read all those examples. So the question for Professor Xue Yu is that, according to your personal experience, what is the risk of being too free? And then question for Professor CRIVELLER is that, according to your personal experience, what is the limit of being centralized? Okay, two very interesting questions. Shall I invite Professor Xue Yu to respond first?
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, these are very good questions, and but yeah, it's truly the big problem and challenge for Buddhist community. I think you may aware of some quite of media news about the imposters of Buddhist monks or living Buddhas. So who could be identify them as living Buddha or prove them as living Buddha, or who could justify their claim? So this is a big challenge in the Buddhist community, because in Buddhism there is no, at the very beginning, no centralized authority to deal with this kind of problem. But in if you are a member of the Sangha, for example, the temples, in some specific temples or particular temples, and then that kind of impostor could be identified and excommunicated. But if for outsiders who, just like they could interpret or do everything in the name of religion, in the name of the Buddhism. So Buddhism could do nothing. Actually, Buddhist organization or Buddhist community could do nothing to deal with them. And only to report to the government or to some kind of, if this kind of person or peoples did not violate the law, they will be always free. So that is a big challenge. But I think there is also checkpoint here. For Buddhists, they should be aware of so kind of so karma. Means you must interpret or act correctly according to Dharma. If you intentionally some kind of distort or for a self-interest, and then some kind of karmic force will be rebound upon you. So that some kind of, you can say some kind of measurement would be there to prevent this kind of practice. But it's very difficult, especially for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Xue Yu. Professor CRIVELLER. What's the limit of being too centralized?
Well, this centralization is not a good term, a term that I like, but I understand and I respect that the Catholic Church is a community where the Pope and the bishops serve the unity of the people of God. So there are differences, there are different cultures, there are different understanding of certain things, but at the end of the day, it's also very important that all faithful can recognize themselves in something that is familiar for all of them. And also that this unity is not a unity, let's say, or an horizontal unity among all the people around the world, but is also unity with the beginning. And the beginning is the message of Jesus. So I think this is the role of the central unity body that we have in the church, which I think is very important. When this become a suppression, so to speak, of the legitimate differences, then of course this is not something that helps the Catholicity. The Catholicity of the church means exactly that the church is familiar everywhere in the world, but different terms can be interpreted in different manners, and we should not be afraid of that. I said earlier that, for example, Christianity is not a religion. Maybe someone would be surprised or object to that, but in fact, early Christians were persecuted exactly because they were not religious. The religion was the religion of the Roman Empire. The Christians did not follow that. They were considered atheists, and this is why they were persecuted. Matteo Ricci in China, he was very open, but in fact, because this was the theology on those days, he thought that there could be only one religion, and that religion must be true. So there's not many religions, there is only one. So when he referred to Buddhists and to Taoists, etc., he called them sects, which is now a term that we do not consider positive. Nowadays, even the Pope speaks that we have to do inter-religious dialogue because there are different religions in the world. Matteo Ricci will not find that acceptable, just to speak. So the term religion has three completely different meanings in the same history of the Catholic Church. So we should not be obsessed with the meaning of the terms. We rather should be in the church with this openness and let those who have authority in the church, the bishops and the Pope, to exercise their role, but without giving up our freedom to discuss and to explain and to live our faith.
Okay, thank you. I think there's another question again for Professor CRIVELLER, right? It's a very contemporary and relevant question to us. So from Charles Xu, there is a tendency of a culture in internet, which we experience as an all or nothing exclusive way to identify friends or foes, particularly among the youth. How could we accommodate such bipolar attitudes in the process of evangelization in the media?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's not really that I'm an expertise on this word, because young people are much more expert than myself. I still have trouble to know how to use a computer, so to speak. I'm next to in 10 days I will go to Thailand, and we have a 10 days course for PIME missionaries in Asia, discussing about this, the communication and about this, because it's not only about instruments to use, but it's about a new, different way of living. And Cardinal Tagle was very right, saying that these are not instruments to evangelize, but these are a new world that must be evangelized. When I was saying that people might live different culture within ourselves, this is especially true for the people who cannot be coherent in their lives, going through the internet to the digital world and practicing their faith, having time for their family, for their friends. When a person is not able to live in a harmony of these different moments of their life, we have people who are not living a decent life and a sane life. In fact, we have so many people now, there are always people who are divided in themselves, who could not find a centralized point in their life, especially young people. The other phenomenon that the person who asked the question is right. Many people have observed that well, internet is a place for freedom, yes, because we find a lot of information. We, in fact, find also many fake news who looks like true news, but in fact, they're fake. So this distinction is already very complicated issue. But generally, many people on the internet read and meet people who think like them and avoid people who do not think like them. And this is, and so therefore, this is not really a dialogue with the diversity. Another situation that I found in the internet is that very easily the people in the internet give the worst of themselves. People write terrible things on the internet, even if in real life probably they will not have the the guts, the courage to say so. So the internet is a very is our world today. So in the early days, the church was afraid of books. Books must be not only the church, also in the early days, all the dictators and all. Books must be burned, because if people can read anything, then there is no truth anymore in the world. Now we do not mind people reading books, but we mind people using internet in a way that become obsessive and not healthy for them.
Okay, thank you. I wonder, is there any question for Professor Maynard? If I can see.
John, I have two questions. I don't know why I come to this question and answer to my screen.
Yeah.
Should I answer?
Yeah, I noticed two questions.
Oh.
But I was wondering, any question first for Professor Maynard?
Okay,
yeah. Well, can I ask a very quick question for Professor Maynard? Because just now you mentioned the MEYNARDs commenced their missions in Jiangmen in 1924, right? That aroused my attention because that's my hometown, Jiangmen, right? So I was wondering, is there any legacy of the MEYNARDs in Jiangmen? I mean, over the past decades? Probably not, but have they made any attempts to trace their roots or try to reestablish some footprints in Jiangmen?
Yes, I think for the MEYNARD, I mean, the German, especially this island of Shanchuanda, because you have it was the place where Francis Xavier died. So for the MEYNARD, it was very important place symbolically. And so, but the report I have read, in fact, were quite negative. I mean, the report of the peoples and of the Chinese priests over there were somehow quite negative about the work of the MEYNARD. But perhaps it is only one period of time, so I don't know. I haven't investigated. But what is left today of the work of the MEYNARD, there's still, I believe, still some things to be researched, investigated. But I think when we go to Shanchuanda, in fact, we don't see much things left. In fact, in terms of Christianity and.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for telling us the story in early 20th century. Thank you. Yes, let's go back to another question for Professor Yu in the Q&A session. It's about the mindfulness meditation is widespread among US hospitals. Is it well received or accepted by the patients? Are they aware of its background? So it's a question from Katharina Faith. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure,
short answer. Yeah, it's well received, but in different area. I think the popularity is different in the hospitals, because this kind of meditation session in hospital is part of this kind of medical treatment. For example, some kind of serious person, patients, depressed or suppressed or some kind could not find sleep. So they went to the hospitals, and in the hospitals, doctors recommend them to this department called mindfulness meditation department. So they get some kind of session for training, for example, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. But in this become very well received by patients, and the result is very good and the outcome, because the cure, the much improvement. So that's why this kind of mindfulness meditation is very popular among the intellectuals and the middle class, especially among the middle class. And every year, according to some kind of statistics, more than 400 peer-reviewed articles on this mindfulness meditation every year. So you could say this how popular, and also among the university students, they have for example, the Chicago University, they have this kind of centers for mindfulness meditation, and every weekend, the group of people so do the meditation there, and so it's and it's certainly they are not aware of the Buddhism actually. They just practice it, and if we ask who is the Buddha or what is the Buddhist philosophy, and they know little. So
okay, thank you. There's actually one more question for Professor Xue Yu. So in Buddhism, Dharma usually means cosmic law and order. Can we relate it to the natural law in Catholicism or to the Tao of Taoism? Does it further imply that following the natural law can reduce suffering?
Oh, thank you.
Question from Charles. Charles Chu.
Charles Chu. Thanks. These are very good questions. And I think the Dharma in Buddhism is very nuanced meanings. So it could be everything. I think it's in general, it could be essence as well as the phenomena. So the phenomena and essence in Buddhism united together, it could not be separate as a unity. So the Dharma could be the essence as well as the phenomena. So this is so it could be the law and order as well as the function of the law and order. So in the Buddhism, the cosmic law, is part of the Dharma. And actually there are 5 law and orders. One is called the natural law, so-called the change of the phenomena, and the change of our mind, physical, also called the spiritual law or the so-called mental law, and also called the bija, so-called, and the karma, and the chitta, and the so this called is somehow is some kind of change of phenomena regularly. So we could understand. So your question here is how could this natural law can reduce suffering? Law could not reduce, but we understand this law, so we could reduce the suffering. The law itself is there, just like a Dharma could not do nothing, but we as this kind of we grasp it and then follow it, understand it, follow it, and then the suffering will be reduced or eliminated. This is my answer.
Okay, thank you. I hope I haven't missed any question. Are there new questions from the audience? There's a question from Dr. Cynthia about the church in Korea, but I think because it's not in this panel, so I think I'm not going to raise that question. And but in fact, the question has been answered by the relevant presenter. So any other questions you would like to raise for our 3 presenters today? No? I think a lot to digest and to absorb. Probably we can finish, if there are no other questions, then maybe you can finish a few minutes earlier, and then I pass the mic back to Lucia. Okay, once again, thank you so much for our 3 presenters for their very fascinating and interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor John Lai. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lai and our speakers. Now we will have the honor to have Father Patrick giving the concluding remarks for us. We will invite all panelists to turn on your video. If you have problems turning on it, you may click the raise hand function on the Zoom panel at the bottom to signal us for help. And if there is time, then you can also turn on your mic to give feedback after Father Patrick has made his remark. Thank you.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Anselm, when I talk too long, you just say time is up, then I shut up. So first of all, probably many of you may wonder what I'm doing here. First of all, my name is very difficult to pronounce, Patrick Taverne. And I have been invited by Anselm, the director of the center, to be mainly to be the consultant. So I was very honored because first of all, it was Father Hakelung who was supposed to do the job, but he retired, so he passed it on to me. That's how things goes. But apart from this, first of all, I must express my gratitude and also my joy because this whole experience of this conference has been really a whole journey. And during that journey, we have worked together. First of all, Anselm as our leader, and then Lucia doing a lot of work, Cynthia, and then I think Anthony, who came up with the idea of the whole conference. So thanks to you all. And so I'm supposed to make some closing remarks. I must thank first of all the previous presenters because they have already taken away some of my work by referring to some interesting reflections upon this conference. So these 3 days have really been a very inspiring, very rich, very fruitful, I think for the most of us. And I still remember the first speaker besides Anselm, Father Stefan de Rootlin. He was supposed to give some final remarks together with me. But he mentioned 3 challenges, especially from the point of view from the Matteo Ricci Institute in Macau. One was the comparative spirituality in China, moral leadership, and social innovation. 3 very important challenges, which has been partly raised during this conference. What Father Rootlin mentioned was the famous adagium by Saint Anselm, your saint, Fides querens intellectum. I like this because I didn't study Latin, but according to what I know from the translation, so it's faith seeking understanding. And nowadays, some modern theologians have turned it around and they have been talking about understanding faith. But I think this is also one of our questions, even today, when we tackle so many problems, you know, really to try to understand more. But as Cardinal Tagle said, you know, probably there are more questions than answers. And so probably these 3 days raised more questions than giving answers. Then we had our bishop, the bishop of the Hong Kong Diocese, Bishop Stephen Chow. He talked about the triple dialogue of the Hong Kong Diocese, dialogue with cultures, dialogue with religions, and dialogue with the poor. So some of these aspects have also been addressed during this conference. And then, of course, we had Cardinal Tagle. I agree with what Father Gianni said. You know, I really was very inspired by his keynote speech. And I'm not going to summarize it, but I'm going just to take up some of his main points, just to refresh our memory. So, especially in the point of view from the Vatican in the whole and then Pope Francis, of course, the whole reform in the Curia, and also the reform of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples to a dicastery for evangelization. Cardinal Tagle reminded us of the central place of the person of Jesus Christ. When we talk about renewal, when we talk about reform, the center of evangelization is preaching the good news. And for us, for Cardinal, the good news is a person, the person of Jesus Christ. And his question is, I think we have all to ask, or as Christians, to ask ourselves this question and to try to answer it. Does he still occupy the central place in our work, in our lives? Gospel is a person. The church, Gianni's talked about that from a theological point of view. We are members of his body, the members of the body of Jesus Christ, and animated by his spirit. So the whole idea of Pope Francis is pastoral conversion, the reform of the Curia. So I think for all of us, not only for the Curia, is are we open to scriptural renewal, the action of God, which we try to discern in this very complex word? Are we open to evangelization by Jesus Christ? And in all of this, Cardinal emphasize, the aspect of art, of beauty, how to make this community, how make this church more beautiful, more attractive to people. Then his second point was propaganda fide. In the whole process of reform, we have, of course, first evangelization to non-Christians, the phenomenon of new particular churches in the world. But above all, for them, the question is fundamental questions of evangelization in the world today, which is a real challenge to tackle. And I think we will need a lot of cooperation and collaboration to tackle these questions. Then what I found very interesting is in our mindset, Gianni talked about map making. In our mindset, there is this connection, this twinning of colonial conquest and missionaries. And usually, if you look at the history of the missions in China and also elsewhere, you have this mentality, this traditional mentality of classifying territories, mission territories, as territories that are not yet evangelized. So we send evangelizers from territories that are supposedly to be evangelized and so forth. But what he pointed out is very important today, actually the fluidity of boundaries between and in these territories. And I was really very impressed by the talk today of Xue Yu about Buddhism, developing in America. Today, indeed, we have a lot of movement of people. We have a movement of ideas. And so in all this, what we have now is to pay attention not to the territory, but to the context in this territory. And Cardinal gave us some examples of the big change in mentality and views within the church. But what Gianni emphasized, and I completely agree, this comes from Vatican II. Every baptized person, wherever he is an evangelizer in need of constant evangelization. I think this is a challenge to all of us. And then especially in the spirit of communion, not as only as an individual, as a missionary community. Every community has something to share, every community has something to give and to receive. So again, what Professor Thierry brought out for the case of Buddhism, you know, the cultures, according to the interpretation of Vatican II, the culture of this world are blessed with elements of truth and with elements of the embodiment of the gospel. I was glad to read in his paper, he used the word evangelization. He used the word of healing, actually what we are also doing when we talk about the person of Jesus Christ. So what Pope Francis, in one of his latest letters, encyclicals, we are all brothers and sisters. And then especially we face today so many people on the move or forced to move. And then the third point, which Gianni also mentioned, social communication. And we had a very interesting, lively discussion on the second day about social communication, and also very interesting papers introducing the thing. So social media indeed is not a means, a media in the world, but a world in itself. It's an ecosystem that needs to be evangelized, rather than we using social media to evangelize. I found this a very interesting point in the presentation of Cardinal. So he said at the end, let us learn from Jesus. He is an Asian. And if you look at me, I'm not an Asian. But I've been living for almost 50 years in Hong Kong and 25 years in Europe, you know. So probably you cannot see it, but in my heart, I am Asian, or I feel as an Asian. Okay, then a quick, brief overview of the contributions we had, very rich contributions. We are very grateful for this. The first day we had 3 examples, you know, missionary work in Asia, very interesting. We had Korea, we had Japan, and we had Indonesia. If you look, or if you remember the presentations, you will notice that how different, how special the gospel, the evangelization developed in these 3 different areas, you know, especially Korea. What is really amazing that it was the evangelization was started by lay people, but then soon they needed a priest, and they looked in Beijing for a priest and so on. But basically it was a lay movement. And then later on, after a lot of persecutions and developments and so on, it led to the establishment, I think quite unique in Asia, is the establishment of a Korean missionary society. Usually many missionaries that are now sent out from Asia or Southeast Asia, you know, their background is a religious congregation or a religious order or a missionary congregation. But here we have a bishop, Bishop Choi, a Korean, who establishes a missionary congregation, quite successful. Yeah. And then of course comes the question whether and to what extent lay people should be involved. And we had Japan, very interesting paper. As we all know, the mission in Japan was started by Francis Xavier. Then later on, we have the great, again, martyrdom, the famous martyrdom. And then at the same time, the conflict between Padroado missionaries and propaganda Fide missionaries. Indonesia, again, quite a different story. Although it was started by the Portuguese, by Francis Xavier, we have the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. I was very happy to hear some Dutch from our presenter. As you know, the Dutch, they are, at that time, they were basically Calvinist and so on. And so under their rule, their colonial rule, I mean, the Catholic Church was not allowed to develop. What I found now today, of course, Indonesia is a sovereign country. Majority is Muslim, 66% are Muslims, only 3% are Catholic. It's a small community, but very vibrant, very active. And they also are sending out a lot of missionaries. But what I found very interesting remark by Father Armada, was what he said: we are all close, but not so close. What he mentioned, you know, he appears China, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. Indeed, we have, of course, the FABC, 50 years, but the contact between these communities and so on the grassroots level, you know, is lacking. Of course, there is the question of the language and the culture, translation, as Gianni said, but I think in the future, the center here can play an important role in developing more and more contacts among these groups and among these Christians. Then we had propaganda fide in history. This is my field of interest and expertise. I found it very interesting, especially Claudia Funcolani. You know, because she's an expert in Latin, so she was able to translate all these Latin documents of the Acta Pekinensia into English, together with Professor Ru. They worked on this project and so on. And I heard there will be 4 volumes, and so still 2 volumes are coming. Very interesting. And there we really very tragic story, you know, and the conflict between the cultures, the court cultures of Europe and the court culture in China, the encounter there between the Tournon and the Kangxi Emperor. Then a marvelous presentation by Eugenio Menicom, very clear, you know, based on the archives in Propaganda Fide, gives us a very clear presentation about the workings, I mean, the administrative workings of Propaganda Fide. And then, of course, we are looking forward to the publication of the famous catalog, which was prepared by Atte Duding, you know, the Chinese documents in Propaganda Fide. Okay, then we come to social communication. I'm not, like Gianni said, I'm not an expert, and I struggle also. I'm an immigrant, a digital immigrant. I still struggle with computer and all that kind of stuff. But indeed, it's really becomes a very big challenge. We had, first of all, Dr. Anthony Lam, who gave us a critical evaluation of the present social media. And then he came up with the extraordinary suggestions to start a Cathopedia. I'm always thinking about Wikipedia and so on, but later on, who knows? You know, it will happen. So, of course, all the presenters, most of the presenters later on, Kanita and then also John Mee, they went through all these documents presented by the Vatican on social media. Then what I found very interesting was Elmo Gonzaga, the iconographies of the climate crisis in Southeast Asia. And then he was able to give us some film excerpts, you know, to show all this, how this is done and how it is presented in global news media, very insightful. Then the next session was Christianity and social media. Actually, the outcome of our conference is COVID-19. Why do we have a webinar? Basically, it's COVID-19. And then we had even a typhoon. It was not a typhoon, but anyway, it's a shifting of the medium, and of course it has some disadvantages, but it has also advantages. You know, listening to Korean missionary in Alaska, and then to several our presenters either in Europe, Canada, or the States, or even in Asia, wheresoever, you know, this is really an amazing thing. So what Khalida said, and Andrew Wall's idea about the pilgrim principle, Christians are always pilgrims in culture. You know, we are moving from one culture to adopting a new culture and so on. And then, of course, she mentions the problems connected to the new media materiality. I think Anselm is very interesting later on, you know, about the sacraments and how the church deals with it. I think it's a very fascinating, interesting topic. Then also the influencers, and then the communication itself. And what she said, I think so, she's right. Church has to be hybrid, online and offline, you know, but how to keep the balance, that's of course a major challenge. Then Father John Mission, who has a long time experience there with Radio Veritas, I think his talk was really amazing. And then especially at the end, the things that were not in his paper were even more interesting, especially the story about the musician, which engendered the reaction from Shrey, you know, when all your instruments are destroyed, can you still produce music? Music is in the heart. But how does this happen? And here we really have a very interesting topic, you know, about communication. How do you communicate faith as such? And that is not only limited to Christianity, that is true for all religions. Then Father Bernardo, very interesting, you know, propaganda fide. He tackled the problem from a European point of view. And if you look at the history in Europe, of course, the Vatican or propaganda fide dealing with these tremendous changes in European history. So from the 1700s to the 1800s, he said it was a very difficult time. And then what Thierry MEYNARD mentioned, you know, the influence of Maximum Illud in 1919, very important, it's not an encyclic, it's a pastoral letter of Benedict XV. But I think it really addressed the many problems that Gianni and Thierry mentioned in their papers. And then, of course, the different press agencies, Fides, UCAN, Ecclesiastes, Asian News, and so on. And then very interesting, you know, what is the difference between promotion and propaganda? You know, the terms we use, sometimes we need to be very critical and know very clearly what we are talking about. Okay, I think I covered the second day. Then for our last day, that's still very fresh in our memories. We had what the Cardinal mentioned, you know, the exchange, I mean, the dialogue between faith and science and faith and culture. What I found very interesting is Professor Udias in his paper, because I had also a problem with the idea that you have, but I think Thierry MEYNARD also mentioned or raised that problem, you know, how do you make a difference between a missionary who is really science-oriented and one who is not? I think once I listened to a talk given by Professor Standaard in Leuven, where he explained to us that the time of the Jesuits, you know, if you look at their Ratio Studiorum, is very different. Their education is very different from the education today. Because at that time, the whole setup was really a pyramid. You had down logic, rhetoric, then you had mathematics, you had physics, then you had metaphysics, and on top of that was theology. That was top of the whole thing. So it was a very integrated thing. So this whole dichotomy, that division between, missionizing faith and science and so on is really a modern phenomenon. Originally, it was not. And I found very intriguing the Professor Diaz, he quoted there Ferdinand Verbist, the role of astronomy in the whole faith progress. You cannot split them up. It's one part one part of the deal. So that was very interesting. And then, of course, today's presentation by Xue, I found it very amazing and intriguing. I have known Xue many years in the center there, and he was always smiling, and I was always smiling, but we really never entered in a real dialogue. So I'm so happy that it happens today. Then, of course, Thierry MEYNARD. I think I understand your choice, because you are supposed to be an expert in the time of Matteo Ricci and so on. So I was surprised to see your change of topic, because this is my topic, 19th century, early 20th century, the history of the religious congregations. And I'm really intrigued by Fouquet and the whole process that helped that developed in Canton in Guangzhou. Okay, Anselm, I think that's all what I have to say today.
Okay, thank you, Father Patrick Tavain. And I think I have to give you a big applause, because a wonderful concluding remark. Yeah. And you help us, to record a memory of this 3-day wonderful journey, And of course, I don't have your capacity to make any concluding remark at this moment, but I would like to share my experience. I was inspired by Cardinal Taglia's speech on the first day, and in particular, he said, we are called, by Jesus Christ to share or to spread the gospel, so-called to evangelize. But today, in our new era or digital era, you make use of this social media, the new platform. But other than to evangelize in this new platform, and we have to evangelize this new platform, the social media. So in this 3-day journey, the program, and I think I felt, at least myself, this sharing, not only the knowledge, not only the information, but I felt the passion for knowledge, the passion for our faith, the passion for following Christ. And I was also touched by John, Father John Michen's sharing, and you always talk about the sharing of life, and of course he is challenged by Professor Xue Yu, like mic to mic communication. But I think we actually in these 3 days, because of our sharing of life, our being here, we evangelize this webinar. We not only communicate, our ideas, whatever. We really make it alive, this new platform, this network. And thanks for the pandemic, we can get together, through this new technology, the webinar. And so we can get together, wherever we are, in the States, in US, in Canada, in Europe, England, Oxford, and also in Asia. And so I think it can I'm so happy and also, filled with joy that our center and Macau Ritchie Institute can provide this platform for dialogue, for building up a new culture or to evangelize this new platform. So it's just like a first step, I hope we can work together to make new effort. I don't know how to, say, maybe it's a kind of accommodation and let the social media be a manifestation of our being, and not only a manifestation or, just expression of our ideas. So my heartfelt gratitude to all esteemed scholars, moderators, speakers, and I myself learned a lot, and I bring a lot of not answers, but questions, to think, at least for the coming few months. Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, I have to thank our team, Father Patrick, Cynthia Poon, Lucia, Thierry, Anthony Lam, and well, thank you for your hard work and for the past, I think, 18 months, thank you. Any speakers want to share something before the closing?
I would just to say hello to everyone who have been present in these 3 days. And it was very interesting and beautiful for me, not only to listen to many people, but also to see faces of dear friends and colleagues that I respect very much. And then I also see and meet new faces. It was a great experience. Thank you. It was a privilege to be part of it.
Thank you, Gianni.
Yes, I guess I want to make sure I get this through too. I think I would like to say that personally and as church, at least we in Hong Kong, would not be what we are today without the missionaries. So I think, even though we talk about the importance of localization, having the local clergy and hierarchy and all that, I think I'm grateful for their presence. And also I think if we take an analogy with the post-colonialism in the political context, I think just getting rid or getting over the colonial mentality or structures may not be enough for us to be the church that we ought to be. I mean, look at all the failed states in post-colonial situations. So I think Cardinal Tagley and some of the presenters also reminded us today of the importance of the pastoral conversion for all of us. Not just the local clergy, but the local lay people, everybody in the church. So I think that's important. Thank you all.
Thank you, Cynthia. There's a lot of things, kept in the heart, okay. I hope, one day we can, get together in person, the hybrid mode, as Khalida said, not only online, the network cell, but also, in person, we like, for our Chinese, we like to have dim sum, to have meal together, eating, to share our friendship. Thank you once again, to all the participants, the audiences, speakers and moderators. Hope to see you again.
Before we leave, we take a few photos by screenshot. So be sure your face is turned on, facing the camera. Okay.
Professor
Han Chi, could you lower your? Yeah, I cannot. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thank you. 1, 2, 3. Okay, cheers.
Cheers.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Lam, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you all the participants,
Goodbye.
attendees too.
Yeah.
Yeah.